show at Centrespace Gallery. It's exciting that we finally got this up and running. It's been about 3 years in the planning of this show. That's it. In 2019, we had Laura gave me a call, and and she was saying, well, go on, you say.
Well, it's something that I sort of had in my head for a little while about doing an exhibition around the climate crisis, and come in.
Yeah, feel free to come in.
Come in and join if you want to. Just talk.
Last talk about the thank you.
That's right. And yeah, doing something that sort of, that would, I suppose I'm really interested. I'd sort of, for a little while I've been an activist and I've been really interested in environmental issues, but I never really combined that with my artistic practice. And I knew that John was similarly interested, and so and it's less than to do it with him than to do it completely on my own, and I thought it would be really nice if we were able to collaborate more together. And so I phoned him, and we went from there. And then, of course, the pandemic happened.
So the point is we were trying to tie this exhibition in with COP26 happening the following year, which then didn't happen because of the pandemic. So it's the idea is to actually have a physical show. We did have an online show last year, and some of the artists here today were part of that, but we're delighted to have this show finally up and running.
And thank you to the artists, all of them, for joining us and for their support and collaboration, and they're sort of generously giving us their time and sharing their work with us, because it's been a real privilege to work with all of them. So,
really
thank you very
So
much.
just to give you a little context to the speakers today, I'm just going to run through the artists, but then once I've done that, you guys will introduce yourselves. And so Christina, we'll start with you. So just to say, Christina is a British Asian transdisciplinary artist, creator, educator and researcher. For this show she's exhibiting a piece called Maquette of Living Sites located in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, salvaged in 2020. It's made from all kinds of materials such as acrylic glaze, sharp teeth sand, soil and jesmonite. You can see it at the front of the gallery by the doorway there. Danielle Banks, as you can see here, she's a Scottish artist and designer, basing her practice around drawing, learning and reuse. She researches creativity and community, and here is showing a series of drawings of trees around Glasgow, which we displayed around the gallery space. You can see here, there and in the back over there. Camilla Brandon is a multidisciplinary artist using colour and form inspired by ocean habitats and issues to create visually appealing installations from found materials. And for this show, she's exhibiting a kelp forest on land using a range of recycled and throwaway materials. You can see those hanging from the ceiling. Nicola Willis is an artist who works from heart and soul. Sorry, I'm reading your writing here, Nicola. She enters a deep relationship with materials and emotion. And for this show, she's exhibiting 3 sculptures, which are like embodiments of parts of the psyche. And an improvised drawing called Winter to the Wild, which was a joyful connection with soul, and an interactive collage book as well, which you can see in print over there. Britt Alexander is a science officer at the European Marine Board in Belgium. She runs Embracing the Ocean Artist in Residence program. Ingali Smart is an African female photographer, illustrator, and visual artist. And for this show, she's exhibiting a series called What in Her Life, showcasing photographs of a project she did with water aids in Sierra Leone. You can see the photographs at the back of the gallery over there. Laura, I would introduce you, but maybe as the co-curator of the show, maybe you should talk about yourself.
So I'm Laura, I'm an artist, curator and educator, and in this show I'm exhibiting 2 works that I made specifically for this exhibition, continue to explore my interest in plants and how we can learn from plants in the context of the climate crisis.
Yeah. And I'm Dominic, and my work you can see over there is the chalk drawings on black paper. my interest is in mycelial networks beneath the forest floor and how they connect and can inspire us to kind of think differently about the world through these massive living organisms beneath the forest floor, and how although the new research going into this space is helping us to kind of think about forests and forest ecosystems as being far more than just kind of useful products and actually kind of living organisms which we need to protect. So let's start by letting the artists themselves introduce themselves. And Camilla, do you want to talk about you and your practice and maybe a little bit about what you're showing here at the exhibition?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Camilla Brendan, and I've been working with found and recycled materials for about 15 years. And this came from a painting background. I started sort of running with objects, painting on them, which turned into installation, and then I started using found newspapers and filling spaces, which led on to plastic. So it's been an evolution like that over time. And since about 2018, I've been collaborating with Brit to visualise ocean issues using the installation techniques I described. So this was a journey from talking about ocean plastics, phytoplankton to kelp forests, and I currently do work around all of those topics. So kelp forest is the sort of main project I'm working on, and we thought it was important to bring kelp forests more to public attention in the way that forests on land are seen as crucial for the resources they provide: food, habitat, oxygen production and carbon store. So kelp forests behave very similarly but underwater. But below the kind of glassy surface of the sea, things can be out of sight, out of mind. So the idea with this installation was to make it really accessible, taking away the need for scuba diving, taking away the barriers really, so anyone could walk around it. And then the second sort of aspect to this work is making it visible that art is accessible and that you can create work with what already exists rather than buying expensive materials. For this installation I used some marker pens, and that's all. Everything else was waste fishing line, packaging from markets, things like beach combing, walking on canal towpaths. And a major part of my practice is to run workshops, intergenerational, predominantly art workshops. And I really hope that this provides a platform for dialogue in a relaxed way, and also inspires adults and young people to create more freely, knowing that what they use doesn't have to be costly.
Yeah.
Right, do you want to expand on that as you're working together on this?
Yeah, so yeah, me and Millie have she's been working together for about 3 years or so, and I'm a marine scientist, so actually we just realised that we had a lot of common interests just by talking to each other about our work, so we thought it would be interesting to explore this more together. So we basically both share ideas with each other, and I help Millie more at the conceptual stage of the project to think of like certain topics that might be of interest to explore. And so my job is as a science officer at the European Marine Board. So it's a think tank in marine science and policy. And we're basically in between the scientists and the policy makers, and we work with most of the marine scientists, the major marine research institutes in Europe and their scientists, and we develop advice on what are the future research priorities, mainly within the context of developing a sustainable future pathways related to the ocean. So a lot of it's linked to climate change, obviously. And there's also quite some discussions in that science policy space about the need for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work, and also how we can engage
policies to be effective, you have to have the communities on board as well in the wider population. So
I just see artists as being a kind of a means to kind of communicate with people outside your own.
yeah, exactly. There's multiple roles that that artists can play in that space for sure. Yeah, and we've so sort of as a result of that, we have developed in the last year an artist in residence program. So it's in its first year this year, and we offer grants for artists to develop work together with scientists, and really with the aim to increase the societal awareness of the issues that are facing the ocean, but also how the ocean can act as a solution to things like climate change, and really trying to inspire people to change their behaviours to have a more sustainable future.
Yeah. Christine, do you want to expand on that from your side? Like, where does the artist come in with kind of conversations around the climate crisis in terms of acting as that bridge between scientists and the public?
This is me, yes?
Yes. Oh, sorry. I'm speaking at the wall, but I should really be speaking at the laptop.
I think there's a couple of ways in how that works. I think number one, I think that probably dovetails onto a few of the other questions that Laura shared, is that I think some of the premises that are being put there in terms of kind of the transdisciplinary collaborative work, I think are really key. I think firstly, in terms of the artists kind of coming into those ideas, is that I do think there has to be an equity in terms of how that transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary framework works. I would say, so from one side, I've seen some most amazing kind of creative opportunities where you get to work with artists, one of the privilege of being able to do that, but I also think it's the case where it can't just be, say, a mouthpiece. I think there has to be an equitable weight in terms of, say, creative disciplines and then also scientific practice as well. So then from the very foundation, the start of that collaboration and that kind of transdisciplinary framework, then you have an equity in terms of investment, not just in terms of practice in its role, but also in terms of the outcomes and how they can build into that sustainability. I think artists and artistic practice is incredible in that way because they really are, I think, at the forefront of kind of conceiving and putting forward ideas and practices of like radical hope and transformation, really playing around with those. And I think that's not just in terms of, say, art and science. I think, you were touching on, say, communities there. I think, many times historically, we've seen the marginalisation of, say, local communities and indigenous knowledges, practices, all of those different kinds of things. So it's absolutely key that those have an equity and they have a weighting within those practices, within those voices. And I think, was it in April this year, it was the first time that the IPCC had notified the role of colonialism in terms of climate change and how that's been a factor in how important and how critical social justice is within digital transformation. So I think the artist is definitely critical in that and all these different kind of stakeholders. So I think that's, we'll talk about in terms of that residency program and your point of view. I think it's something that I absolutely feel myself.
Yeah. I like the phrase radical hope. I think that's kind of something which, Laura and I were chatting about it earlier, this idea that, when we communicate issues around the climate crisis, that it's something where you need to kind of motivate people to want to kind of change. And if the news is always bad, that, there's the kind of the feeling that you can't do anything because it's we're not in control, then that doesn't really. Sorry. Yeah, come in. Yeah. Well, sorry. Then it can be discouraging and demotivating. Nicola, your work is very much about kind of hope through the objects you create. Do you want to talk us a little bit about through your work?
I think it's about hope. Sometimes I describe my work and then I think, is it like that? So, when you sing or you hear someone singing, you can't really describe what it is that they're doing. That it's not like there's a concept or an idea that you can logically describe, but it's something very magical and really deep, and you just don't know what it is, but it's just really important. And that's what I am doing when I'm making art. And I think also by showing my work here and in places out in the world, I think I'm making a space for something quite tender and soft that I often feel it's embarrassing. It's quite embarrassing for me to be, like, even saying that my art is about heart and soul. It's perhaps in our culture it's not such a normal thing to say. And I realised as I was listening and thinking about what to say that although exhibiting here has been really frightening and difficult because it's been so vulnerable, I think it's important for that reason, for making a space in the world for something like that. And I think being really intimate with yourself and the world and being very vulnerable is something that improves the world about doing that.
And can I add, I think there's something really powerful about being vulnerable, and I think especially in the context of the climate crisis, it's okay for us to say this is a really scary situation, or this is something that's difficult, or in multiple different contexts to say this is something that I find really challenging, but actually if the more that we talk about that and that we're quite honest with each other about it, the more chance there is we can actually progress and do something about it, whereas I think often part of, and that's again links back to the idea of hope, because I think a lot of us feel overwhelmed or scared or frustrated by things we see going on in the world, and we feel alone in those frustrations.
Yeah, last night at the exhibition opening, there was a person I was talking to, and she said it really terrifies me, I'm really scared. It was a relief to hear someone say that, to say yes, I'm very scared too, because it makes it real, and it makes it feel like, oh, there's another person with me, and it's we're in reality, so we're not going to go into some world where there's no longer people caring for each other. We're still together. That's nice.
Yeah.
Danielle, do you want to talk a little about your work and the project you're working on with the Trees series? Oh, yeah, sorry, I'm sticking against the wall, I'm actually sticking to the computer. Danielle, do you want to talk a little bit about your work and the project you're working on with the trees?
So I am interested in using illustration and nature drawing, and I'm interested in representing people's hopes and what they're. I'm interested in basically capturing and representing what people are actually doing, what actions people are taking, and that illustration and drawing part, I'm kind of using it as a tool to try and hopefully convey things visually in an emotive way that have a broader sense of communication and touches people. So the tree artwork came about because I was doing a few community mapping jobs, and I had drawn this tree in Glasgow, and it was really beautiful. It was this old tree, and I came back to it a few months later, and it was just gone. And there was a fence around it, but there was no tree, and I just left the drawing. And the job that I was doing, we still used drawing for what we were doing, and I just was really interested in this sense of the trees that people come across, and some of the trees in the city have names, but some of them are completely unknown and unnoticed. So I kind of collecting people's experiences of trees and nominations of trees people wanted me to draw, like trees people felt close to. And I also chose some trees that I experienced with other people as well. And then mapped them to kind of hopefully send people to visit these trees and give these trees identity and more of a human connection. And also it was just joy. It was just a joy to draw trees. They're so beautiful. And also I suppose it's interesting. I'm really interested in kind of empowering other people's experiences and other people's testimonies and making really good use of that. And yeah.
It's, I mean, it's like we put the show on at the same time as COP, and it's interesting that you're making these drawings at the same time in that kind of build up to COP. What is the kind of role of things like the annual COPs in addressing the climate crisis? Brett, do you want to take on that question?
As a resident scientist.
The role of the COPs, I'm not an expert on it, so. But basically, the main aim is that the political leaders in the world, they come together once a year. And it's since the Paris Agreement in 2015, so it's basically to take stock of where we are in terms of making commitments towards the Paris Agreement, so to keep the temperature rise to between 1.5 and 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels.
Are they engaging people in the way they should, or are they a sort of greenwash for things? Are they effective, or is this?
There's quite a bit of discussion around that. I mean, so it's not the events are not just to get the politicians together, but there's a lot of interest around that main aim. So it does bring a lot of people together, and there's a lot of side events where scientists and communities and I think artists get involved as well sometimes in the side events. So there's a lot of dialogue going on, which I think that's also it's good for everyone to get together once a year to discuss these things. But
is that not a bit sort of almost like the Black History Month? It's sort of, well, it happens once a year. It should be happening far more. It should be happening sort of on a
it should be happening on a regular
basis.
basis. But I think if we didn't have these yearly events, there would be much less progress happening.
Okay.
And it's quite hard to get everyone together and things. So,
Christina, do you feel the same? Is the COP doing enough? Is that the best way we can mobilise people to governments to make changes towards kind of addressing the climate crisis through changes to energy and all that?
And also, can I add as well, sort of like you mentioned social justice earlier, like is sort of as someone that explores that through your work as well. Do you think, is COP making progress on that front? I know, for example, there's been an agreement that's taken place between the EU and developing nations to provide a fund for them in their response to the climate crisis and to support them. But I know there's a lot of nations like the US that aren't really getting on board with that. I know it's all very hugely complex, but have you been following that? Is there any comments you'd care to make, essentially?
Okay, it's about 10 questions in there.
Sorry, Christina.
I think, so again, I think there's always going to be like a kind of multiplicity of approaches because, an annual meeting is better than no meeting. I think that's valid. And I think, okay, so if we take this COP, for example, then we take the last one. I mean, this COP was kind of being touted as one where we were going to have more of an amplification or representation of, say, the voices of the global south. Whereas I think COP26 was there, it was again being argued that there was more of a representation of indigenous voices, origins, although they weren't in those diplomatic rooms, they weren't in that context. So I mean, For me personally, I think the history of a lot of this is incredibly important because it shows a roadmap by where we kind of come. And so if I was to go back, I think in COP26 you had the Prime Minister of Barbados, and she was speaking very candidly about this. I think was it the G77, the countries that are most at risk when it comes to the climate emergency and what's happening to them. And she spoke about the amount of money that was found when it came to the huge kind of global banking crisis, and then what's going to be convened in terms of climate emergency funding for the countries. But the people in those rooms are ones that are, yes, they're all the ones in power, but every country has obviously its incredibly complex politics and histories. So I mean, I don't know that I would necessarily have the perspective if I had a program from two different countries, so I've got it in the Caribbean and I've got it in the UK. So, I think when you look, many times I do find it very interesting that when we think of these kind of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches, they're not necessarily reflected in our curriculums, in our education, in our society. So, for example, many times when people think about colonialism, we're thinking about the historical kind of context of the British Empire, imperial powers, that kind of thing. But in terms of the ecological, environmental impact of what that means, when you put those imperial countries together across Europe, for example, when you think of land clearance, for example, when you think about all the different ways in which the kind of environmental implications of that before you even get to kind of the Industrial Revolution, there's huge factors there. This is about what, the 1700s, you have Europe, this is kind of immense kind of capitalism. So you have that with the kind of, mass kind of global practice. You're not just seeing kind of millions of acres of land, in primary environments, all those kind of things being erased and biodiversity. That they're coming to you. We're also seeing how that links into culture. We're looking at indigenous societies, where you're looking at, people from, we see across, say, the continent of Africa, South America, for example. So, for my work, I think a lot of those things are absolutely at the heart of what we're talking about. So when we're talking about fund down, we're talking about a lot of very rich countries that have benefited from that and that extraction for centuries. And now, when we're in this absolute crisis setting, where a lot of these countries are being the ones that are hardest hit, I think it's, there's real huge questions being asked. I think one thing I would like to maybe put out there to the leaders responsible is kind of questions of whose behaviours need to change. I was at a panel the other day, and it was specifically looking at female-led indigenous backend around movements across the Caribbean into South America, and it is astonishing what they're doing. So in particular, they're going against the kind of oil companies, and now seeing places like Guyana and Trinidad within marine environments being opened up, all these positions being, permissions being given to see this kind of those opportunities. So I think there's so many different approaches, and there's so many different movements, and there's so many different communities and societies that have been working for so long in these kind of areas, and we're making and are bringing back, which I think is absolutely fundamental. So I think all of these different kind of perspectives and these voices and these actions, I think it's always cumulative. If I was, my work is, I've been working with a researcher who specialises in issues like history from coordination with Seychelles. And it's fascinating. He looks a lot, he's been researching wrecks along the UK coastline, in particular the Margate, and he's identified about 50 wrecks that he sees as being from kind of African slavery that were wrecked across the Kent coast, and something that we're looking to kind of look into and see in, because there's very little documentation done of them. But I think the interesting thing about this and this Pete kind of raised is like the linking of cosmologies. So for example, when we think of many of the societies, the way in which the environment and ecology links in terms of cosmologies, how that informs their sustainable practice is a massive question there. So where these practices can be sustainable for the times, like whose behaviours need to change, who are the ones that need to
as a nodding your head.
No.
Well, in which case, like with your own work with the Kelp Forest, does that address behavioural change from Western societies in any ways?
I mean, in making the Kelp Forest, it is to raise awareness of ocean habitat, which is under threat. So I think behavioural changes are necessary to protect ocean habitats. So with regards to Kelp Forest, particular things that put them under threat are changes in sea temperature, so like a rise in sea temperature, and that is really directly linked to CO2 emissions, so that would be everyone living in a more sustainable way, but in particular, like the more developed nations. So yes, broadly to protect ocean habitats. Yeah, lifestyles need to change, and I think it's a good point to like look at yourself and look at who you're around, not look at other people or politicians that need to change. I think like change needs to come from individuals and policymakers together.
Yeah. Well, one kind of an interesting thing on the news recently is there's a US kind of billionaire who's looking to buy a huge space of the Atlantic Ocean to build a huge kelp forest as a means of kind of addressing the climate crisis. Are such projects a good thing? Do we just leave it to billionaires to kind of do these projects for us?
No, absolutely not. Like there's, I think with anything like this, I don't think there's ever a simple answer. I think everything's quite grey. So for a time I thought offshore wind farms, like that's like problemless, people are just complaining because they're not visually that nice, and then I found out how that can disturb like migrating fish and things like that. So I think if a billionaire with solid scientific advice can build a kelp forest in a way that it doesn't actually cause like damaging effects. I don't know, like planting the kelp, like how are they going to do it? Like is there going to be like lots of metals needed for tools which are going to do it? There's just like so many things to think about. But if people who are wealthy can give money to improve the planet's health, then that's great. It just needs to be done in a well thought out and approved way, not in a way to just look good as a show, to improve their status.
Needs to be genuine.
Yeah, Laura, do you want to talk kind of evaded your work so far? Do you want to talk a little about your work and maybe how kind of we can utilise nature as a kind of means to address?
Yeah. So I'm really interested in plants and how we can, what we can learn from them, and I think in the context of the climate crisis, how, I think especially in the global north, historically we've become quite disconnected from nature, from what we consider ourselves, we sort of see nature as a separate thing, as an other that's different to ourselves, rather than kind of seeing ourselves as part of it and sort of in conversation with it, and something that is constantly evolving. And I suppose through my work I am examining my own relationship with plants and the natural world, and also I suppose trying to redress that balance and think about how we can use plants as a way to confront the climate crisis. For me personally, I find a lot of solace in plants. I feel that they give me a lot of hope. They're incredibly resilient beings, and the more, as I paint them, I learn more and more about them. And I think that when I used to include plants in my work, it was always on quite a superficial level, that I just enjoyed working with them, but now I do quite a bit of research about the different plants that I am working with, that I'm sort of studying, and I really love learning about them, and I really want to sort of think more about what we can learn from plants. There's a really incredible scientist who I was talking to someone about today, who I've been following, called Veranda Montgomery, and she's done all sorts of, she's really fascinated by how we can take lessons from plants, not only in terms of sort of ecologically, but also even in terms of how we treat each other. So she says, like, for example, if you're looking after houseplants, if your houseplant dies or is a bit sick and poorly, you never say, you never blame it on the plant. You always say, oh God, what have I done wrong? I must have, I've obviously not provided the right conditions. How can I improve the life of this plant? Or you might seek out expert help, or you might, but she says she's a teacher in a university in America, and with students, she says very typically the response is, if they're not doing well, obviously they're not suited to this environment, or they're not good enough, or there's a failure somehow there. And why don't we treat humans the same way we would treat plants, of saying, actually, maybe we're not providing the right conditions for them. What can we do to improve their environment, their conditions? How can we sort of improve things for them, and therefore improve things for ourselves, and perhaps create a space that is more inclusive and more and actually more productive, and all sorts of things. And so I'm sort of reading a lot about her work, and I'm really interested in sort of those kind of conversations that we can have about, plants are just incredible beings, and in the context of the climate crisis, how we can, and in terms of things like water storage and the way, and also sort of in the way they kind of exist with other species, in a kind of very symbiotic relationship.
Such as fungi.
Well, exactly, yes. Would you like to talk a bit about your work, don't we?
I guess it's sort of the interesting thing with what Laura's saying is that, what I'm really get excited about is when artists kind of work with kind of researchers to kind of find new ways of kind of visualizing what the storytelling is of the latest scientific developments. And there is a huge amount of research, as I say, coming out about how mycorrhizal networks beneath the forest floor are not just kind of dormant to the plant life. Actually, genetically, they're closer to humans, and that's why there's so much kind of medical research which uses fungi as a kind of a base for it. About just over 30% of all medicines on the planet have a kind of a fungal root to use that. So, but what's really coming out now, especially in light of the climate crisis, is that it's not there are the people have known about the symbiotic relationship between fungi and plants for quite a while. That there are millions of different species of fungi around. There are more species of fungi than there are of animal life on the planet. And there's this whole kind of ecosystem beneath the forest floor, which is competing and finding the right kind of partnerships. And all plant life is absolutely dependent on good fungal networks. Now, if we think about kind of things like agriculture and the way we kind of manage lands, and I think that we need to be the researchers which is going into kind of fungal life is suggesting like there are different ways in which we can manage land so that we can protect these networks, because when it's destroyed, when you destroy a fungal network, it will take decades to repair itself. The important thing is to kind of find ways in which we can protect these species. But also on the flip side of this, that we often think in a kind of general, like a simple term, that tree life is really important. You grow a forest, and the forest will just constantly take in carbon from the atmosphere. It doesn't. It does it whilst it's growing. When a tree is building its base, or when a plant's building its base, it will use the carbon to kind of continue its growth patterns. But when it reaches maturity, really the balance of carbon intake and exhaling is about net zero, really. The difference is that what trees are doing is they're working with their fungal partners to store carbon beneath the forest floor in the fungal roots. So about 30% of kind of carbon emissions in the Amazon, for example, are kind of locked in through these fungal spaces beneath the floors, beneath the forest floor. So when you cut down the trees, it's not like you're just cutting down the wood and you can protect that wood and maybe keep it, and the carbon will get back into the atmosphere. But you're exposing the soil to kind of all weather patterns, and then so there's runoff, and means that all these kind of ecosystems are destroyed. So where I think artists are really important, and is what I'm kind of interested in with my work, is taking research which is kind of coming out and finding ways to kind of bridge that kind of storytelling gap between the research and the public, and kind of making that visual. There are so many artists now I'm finding who are working with fungi as a kind of as a base. There's a wonderful sound artist who taps into soil in Colombia and creates these kind of music patterns from the noises which fungi are creating. It's like absolutely kind of fascinating stuff. And so I just kind of find like artists are kind of the storytellers which kind of allow us to kind of work through ideas, that's to say. Danielle, do you want to sort of come in now? I've kind of left you up for a bit, but do you want to talk about the storytelling? Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm speaking to the wall, she's speaking to the computer. Do you want to talk about kind of, so you were talking about with the trees around Glasgow and stuff, that there is a kind of storytelling and narrative to these spaces. The trees themselves, you kind of anthropomorphize in some ways. They are kind of almost like people. Where is that kind of these kind of trees in urban environments and things are? Is there a way in which we can use art as a means to better encourage kind of a better relationship with nature? If that's a kind of a question in there somewhere, but more just a kind of prompt as to. Hello?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. Oh, can you hear me?
I think there's a delay on the line. BBC needs this.
Okay. Start talking. Yeah, definitely. I think so. I think so. Some of the trees I drew, I gave I gave the title sort of the tree that reaches round, or one that's leaning. Sort of thing. I think the trees themselves, it's definitely very easy to anthropomorphize them, because they have skin that changes as they grow old, and even their lifespan. You kind of compare the lifespan of a tree to a human, and it gives you this great respect for a tree that grows to 100 years old. Something all the knowledge, the equivalent, whatever the equivalent is, the knowledge that that tree would have. I think art's an opportunity to sort of offer people these different pathways into their relationship with nature. I think it's really important. I think it's really important that people have all these different choices of how they actually pay their respect to the wild environment. I think there's also a drawback in that sometimes art can misrepresent nature and make it, and also kind of, I think you also have to be careful that you don't sow misunderstanding, that you don't take away all the, it's very tempting to take away all the nasty parts of nature and the dangerous parts of nature, and that's been done in history as well. I think.
But it's kind of guilty of. Oh God, there's a delay.
No, you
But it's kind of guilty of kind of beautifying these things, and that's actually counterproductive.
Yeah. I would like to go back to creating some more art. I used to do this before, but I would like to go back to creating more art that shows some of the dangerous and some of the more unknown parts of nature as well. But yeah, I think you have this way of giving people an access into new ways of picturing their world. And I think that's really important for the people who the people with very different lives to ourselves.
I was going to add to that, if that's okay.
Go on,
I think what you're saying is like really, it's so kind of interesting. There's doing a residency in the Peruvian Mountains with Indigenous scientists, and one of the biggest eye-openers I had is how you can have a belief system, their cosmology, let's say, so particularly the Kakama community, their first child is the first comer. But, you know, they had so many kind of ancestral cosmological practices that linked with how they essentially worked in the forest and things, and a lot of how those strategies take place. However, this kind of incredible kind of relationship with nature and how they came across this incredible kind of respect and this kind of one cultural kind of aspect where they didn't see themselves. However, the Amazon was one of the most predatory environments I've ever been in, and they absolutely reflected that. And they were telling me how they wouldn't think twice of killing that creature if they saw it, because of when they were in that environment. When they were talking about predators within the Amazon, I mean, the absolute kind of very real fear they had of being in those contexts and being in those environments. You know, like malaria, like many children would die under the age of 5, for example, that do not have any sort of safe kind of care and infrastructure, for example. You know, the way which they talked about Quran, I think a lot of fishermen was like that was one of their greatest fears, because when I was talking about being stranded through a storm or something, climbing up to the tree, the piranha were jumping up like 3-4 feet trying to get to them, and they were absolutely terrified. Like if someone was watching like the true crime documentary, you saw, you know, it was on the street, like it was, I honestly, because it was such an eye-opener for me, because I was like, they talked with such veneration, and at the same time, it was just absolutely feel like an absolutely kind of brutal environment that they were in, and obviously their children were playing along the river and things, so they taught, you know, from very early on, like, you know, the second makes you defend yourself against any predator, you know, toddlers like 2-3 years old, it's drilled into their head to do that, you know, and you see like snakes coming out of the river. And I think like you say, like kind of, like how that works within different societies, like how you have this reference in like kind of nature, and then the very reality of living in something that is a very incredibly hostile environment. It's really amazing how people have kind of not even reconciled that, how they just live that kind of experience. Especially with something like in the UK too, I'll make reference to a God really, how they've been in the historic sense. And a lot of our it could go on that really like that, you know, people leave in terms of well, in terms of relation, unless you're experienced as teachers. So yeah, I think it's been fascinating. It blew me away when I learned that. I never thought, from research, all the research I did before I went, none of that was as vibrant and as vivid as when it was played out and how that story came out, and how it featured also in their artwork, in their storytelling, in their murals, in, for example, when they had particular like phrases and things, you know, stuff to spiritual kind of like entities, or how this came out, particularly kind of medicinal practices and stuff, which is really fascinating. So yeah, I completely agree with you. It's really, really interesting that way.
Just kind of going back to Laura's questions initially. Actually, back to you, Chris. So how do you think we could encourage greater collaboration between artists and those in other disciplines? And how do we better foster collaborative working between artists?
I think there's a massive lack of funding for artists in the artistic community in general. So I think that mobilising more resources to support this type of collaboration is really important. And that's more on the practical side. But then also, I think it's not easy, these sort of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary collaborations, and it takes quite a while if you're working with people from very different backgrounds, with very different perspectives, to come to a common understanding, and there's lots of different terminologies used, but I think, if you have these kinds of projects, then you really need to also factor in that it will take you more time to get to a common ground, and so you sort of need to factor that into your project's planning. But I think there's actually a lot of similarities between arts and sciences, but also differences at the same time. But something I've learned in the last few years, being involved a bit more with the arts, is that artists are also trying to understand the world around us and to communicate that and to think about solutions for the future. And that's with a very different approach to the way that scientists do that, but they're actually quite complementary. Also another role for the art in this sort of like collaborative space and environment and that kind of project. I think, we talked already about the role of the art in the storytelling, so to communicate the research, because often it's with a more creative outlet, you can think of different ways to visualize those things, but it also goes two ways. So actually, artists can also help scientists in gaining new insights into their work and also new methods and different ways of working. So one example is one of our current artists in residence, Michael Begg. He's a Scottish sound composer, and he's working with a couple different climate scientists on climate data in the Antarctic, and he's actually sonifying that music and making it into musical compositions to then perform with his ensemble group. But so you can actually, through sonification of data, you can actually help the scientists to gain new insights into the patterns that are in the data, because if you just look at a graph, it's actually more difficult to see the patterns in the data compared to, like, music is actually a really powerful way, because it just, your brain is able to process that in a different way. You can actually notice things, like things that you wouldn't necessarily have jumped out at you in a graph. You can just straight away notice things in
So
the data.
the translation back, instead of going researchers speaking to the public, it's sort of artists can work with researchers to help researchers better understand.
Exactly. And I think that's the aspects that's not so often thought about, or that can be maybe harder to achieve as well. But I think for artists it's important to think about.
Is that increasing then, of more scientists working with artists and finding that there's actually really beneficial collaborations there?
Yeah, I think the ones that do, from my experience, they find it very productive and insightful, and also just to have these really different perspectives from outside of your own field.
How have you found kind of working collaboratively on things like the Kelp project?
So I think I've had a range of experiences working with different scientists. I think it was definitely easier to find scientists who are willing to engage with kelp and with phytoplankton, and I have no idea why that is. But I have, I've really found maybe 2 or 3 kelp specialists who really have given a lot of time to show me research and also help me understand different things around kelp. They know research papers which they can just find more quickly than me. So I think all the meetings I've had with them has just saved me many days of research. And then I think, back to them having something which is more accessible to members of the public, not other scientists or conference settings. It's something that's so tactile. Is a way to help spread awareness of the projects they do in a way that they probably wouldn't be able to materialise themselves. And I've also linked to both the Phytoplankton project and Kelp Forest calls to action. So with the kelp, I always highlight the Marine Conservation Society, who work with the Natural History Museum to do the big seaweed search. So that's citizen science, anyone can take part, and also obviously people can donate money if they want sort of back to Millionaires Building Kelp Forest. Anybody can donate £1 or £10 or whatever they can afford. And I think working with Brit, as someone I've known for a long time and someone who works in policy, she's a communicator, so it's different from working with a straight practicing scientist, and her way with words has been really helpful for me, because I'm someone with dyslexia and dyspraxia, so with that comes I can write things that I understand, but it won't necessarily be that understandable for other people. So I think her practice of helping scientists put papers into readable words, like she can really apply for me. And then I think, I mean, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like I have more of a connection with like artists and community groups and grassroots groups that sort of opened up your eyes to this whole world of like grassroots action and artists.
Yeah. And Britt, actually, is there anything you've learned from the Kelp projects itself?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. Today was the first time that I experienced the Kelp and Critters workshop. So it's nice to sort of see behind the scenes how something like this works. And it was really nice today to see, and also last night at the opening, to see how excited people get about the kelp. It's just so nice. It's like quite a few people, oh, I love kelp so much. And also to see the kids playing with the kelp and walking through the kelp forest and really getting involved in the communal drawing. It was just, yeah, it just showed me how easy this makes, this sort of installation and these kind of workshops, the ease that the public has with engaging with the topic was so nice to see.
The fact that they're tactile and that really allows people just to kind of feel...
Can I just ask a question? What is the, because I don't know a lot about kelp, what is the importance of kelp to the ecosystem? Or to both of you?
Yeah, there's quite a few, but one of the main benefits of kelp is that it actually stores carbon, so it's similar to the roots that Dom was talking about, that they fix carbon in the sediments under the ocean. So it's really important to protect these ecosystems because they can be a major buffer against climate change. But also they provide a lot of shoreline protection, so if there's storm surges and things, it can dampen the intensity of the waves and potential flooding. But they also provide a habitat for a lot of species. So Millie's workshop focused on kelp and critters. So there are some examples of the types of animals that live within the kelp forest. So those are the main benefits. But there's also, they can be used in for developing materials. I think you found out quite a bit about that in your research as well.
So there is biodegradable packaging that's been developed from kelp, so that's something that would be compostable. Kelps can grow really quickly, giant kelp, so in that way it's much better to use than like cardboards and things like that, because obviously I think most of the trees take much longer to grow. And it's used in a lot of foodstuffs as well, like toothpaste, it can be a gelling agent, so it's really useful like that. I do think something to note with the carbon sink is this needs to be kelp forests which are long-lasting ecosystems, like trees. I think the farmed kelp might produce carbon as it lives, but it wouldn't actually store it and sink it. So I think there needs to be kelp forests in the wild alongside farmed kelp. I don't think as you lose natural forests, you can just say, well, we're still farming, and it doesn't equal the same thing.
It has been really nice watching people interact with the kelp forests as they're walking around the exhibition. And so that tactile kind of sense of people being able to kind of touch and kind of feel things is different to what you'd expect from just an art exhibition generally, and what people when they come in. And also to Nicola, your work is, you encourage people to pick up your work and to kind of feel it for themselves. What's the reason you want people to actually touch your work instead of just looking at it on a plinth?
I suppose in a way, like, it's funny that there's that expectation that you can't touch work at all, and why not experience art through touch? Why it's just a thing, and it just happens that the touch is really important in my work. So it's all very activated in my work. So I'm interested in expectations of what's normal and what way we think of things. I like to just let that all go.
Yeah.
Come up with something without worrying about that. Not worrying, just from a totally fresh mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, subverting expectation and yeah, and I think, like you said, because for you the process of making your works obviously is very tactile and a very sensory process in itself. So it makes a lot of sense that for people to fully experience the work, that actually it adds a whole other level to that they're able to touch them and hold them and again, sort of in this exhibition, that it, like we talked previously about how those particular sculptures that you about to touch are very comforting and reassuring objects. So actually, maybe that's quite relevant in the context of an exhibition about the climate crisis as
I
well.
never really think of the word comfort when I talk about it.
No, okay, yeah.
Or maybe I did. But
No,
it
but sorry,
does.
that's my
Yeah, no.
impression.
So thank you. Yeah, with touch, it's yeah, it is comforting. It's funny that I got stuck on when I received people use the word comfort when they're talking about their work, and it's surprising because that was, I think there's some sort of shame about that I hold about making work that might be comforting. It's seen as sort of soft or less serious. Actually, that's something I've been thinking as everyone's talking about the conversations about climate and about COP meetings and about all of that. There's a lot of familiar ways that we are talking, because it's all quite urgent to fix it. But I like to step back and question all the words and all the ideas and all the emotions that we're feeling. Just take a little breather and say, what's going on?
Another artwork which a lot of people have been talking about when they come into the exhibition is Christina's work, which isn't something which people are encouraged to touch, but do you want to give us a little, because it's a maquette, isn't it, for a project which you're working on. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the kind of how you're thinking about this project and where this piece comes in?
Yeah, actually, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I was worried if people touched it, but well.
That's good to know.
It's two things. So I mentioned briefly that I've been working with another researcher, whose name is P. Nichols, and we've been looking at kind of reps and how that links in different kind of ancestry for peoples that have migrated across, not just in terms of the Atlantic, but the Indian Ocean, and how that's kind of linked, and how different kind of ecological and cosmological practices have been kind of lost with that kind of transportation, looking at how we're working in those environments. However, one of the things that came out with that work is I'm really interested in kind of like speculative kind of practice and kind of reasoning and usually these kind of, talk about radical hope and radical transformation and future. There's always that kind of projection where you're trying to imagine how you can imagine a different way of living or multiple ways of being in the world, especially when we talk about the climate emergency in the aspect. So with that work, we kind of, in response to Pete's research, was that kind of came up, we were looking at a lot of the things that, say, for example, the people that are enslaved in the holds of these ships that were coming into Margate, the kind of things that were with them. So this was looking at things like seed saving networks. So for example, they would weave in seeds in their hair, so they could take with them when they got to places. Say for example, that's in the ocean, Seychelles, that kind of area, whether they were taken into the Caribbean or South America, for example. And this migration from kind of seeds and bushing, how actually these seeds and plants So looking at like kind of envisioning what were these kind of pieces that were also historically what they found, things like glass bottles, they found bones, they found seeds, they found all of these different shells that were kind of smuggled in and into the whole of these ships. And it was this kind of really interesting stories that we found about how these different kind of practices that led to, say, for example, biodiversity, the environments that they were coming from, how they fed into kind of, how they were going to sustain themselves and things like this. So we kind of this kind of divination set, which was common, again, across the Indian Ocean in many areas. And this, it kind of expanding out in terms of that storytelling. So with the method that you've got there, you have actually kind of a lot of very specific marine sites that are very kind of sacred sites in these assets. For example, you look at oceanic kind of perspectives and belief systems you have there. And it's this idea that almost these things and objects that they with them became greater than the actual shipwreck of this itself. There's thousands and thousands of wrecks across the Caribbean and different places that are there. And now you've got different teams that are salvaging them, not just in terms of historical context, they're doing that because of the histories and the significance in terms of just different communities and societies, and also as almost marking them as monuments. There's a special dive team actually that does that specifically to mark them as monuments and who have passed in and the stories that are there. And with that, what I found really, what I was looking at was these kind of sacred marine sites, how they linked into practices, cosmological practices, especially in the Grenadines. It was a rare place where you had indigenous, like say for example, African Creole societies all kind of coming together to create these very unique kind of communities. So there's these massive kind of intense variety of practices when it comes to the environment, when it comes to spirituality, when it comes to resistance and strategy and things. And I think one of the key things for me is how you can learn from different systems, different societies and things. So when I look at like say, climate and climate emergency and things, you can look at ecological, environmental movements. I think what can you learn, say, for example, what could you learn from VLF, what could you learn for indigenous rights kind of things that happen, what can you learn from the Greek community, the movements that happen there, how do you disperse like, all these kind of learnings, feed into them, so these learnings, these knowledges that are agile, but also feed into all of these kind of practices that have been there for so long and that have been sustainable, not just in terms of culture and environment, because they're all interlinked. And it reminds me actually of the mushroom work that's there, because I think when I think of practice, I always think that kind of fruit, that mushroom, is almost like the art hub. And then beneath that is all of the myriad of pathways, experience, and ideas and knowledge that feeds into producing these works over the long period of work. So with that sculpture, that piece, what we're looking at is that within my research and practice, I'm looking at working with different collaborators so we can see how, say, for example, sculpture can be used directly as a kind of, I guess, in terms of like intervention and how to lead into restorative ecology. So there's different kind of practitioners in the Caribbean that I'm speaking with, for example, we're looking at how that links with different kind of aspects in terms of emergent media, how that links with ancestral indigenous practices, and we're looking at how to bring these together to co-reduce different ways in which we can see kind of restorative action, particularly when we're looking at coral reefs, for example, in the Caribbean. So we don't just have, say, rising sea temperatures, rising sea levels, you have the conditions of runoff that you have on the kind of hotels and things. You also have, now there's a huge kind of a real critical problem where you have this stony coral tissue disease that's basically taken out loads of vital people to actually build the reefs, and they're being transported along the shipping lanes. You're seeing this particularly in Bahamas and lots of different kind of areas. So there's all these, like in many areas, there's all these multiple kind of critical aspects of the mountain of which we're very exposed to people in Central Africa. So it's really interesting seeing how those collaborations work. I think from our early conversation is looking at how to create these collaborative programs. What we were saying, how to feed in the artist and the researcher, or the artist and the scientist. Like how do we feed into these practices? Like how does that work? The time it takes to make sure that there's just benefit kind of everyone really inform your aspirations. So that piece is kind of expected because I think it's looking at how we might be doing and creating underwater sculpture with the Caribbean and different collaborators to do that. But in general, I think we'd like the photographer's work as well. It's absolutely extraordinary, all the different
just sort of moving into the last, say, 10 minutes of the discussion. So I guess the question I kind of want to ask is what's the thing you want people to take away from this exhibition in particular as they walk out? And Laura, should we start with you then? Sorry.
So, well, I suppose, I mean, when we first talked about this exhibition, I mean, really what we wanted people to get from it, we wanted to create a space that would allow for actually some of the conversations that we're having today to happen. I mean, we spoke to lots of people last night at the Private View about the climate crisis, and, you know, they had their own kind of ideas and really kind of responsive to the artwork. And I suppose, and you know, we wanted to create a space that would encourage lots of different people from the local community to come in and engage and maybe think about their own kind of their own relationship with the environment, with the climate crisis, and you know, for it to feel something that's sort of proactive and hopeful. I suppose it feels at the moment that we're living through for lots of different reasons, that everyone, you know, is living through quite difficult times. Obviously, we're very privileged in the UK in many, many ways, and I you know, obviously appreciate that. You know, we're seeing a fraction of what other people are having to experience, but it's, I suppose for me, what I'd like people to get from this exhibition is actually a little bit of hope and to feel a little bit energised, and to be able to, if, I don't know.
Is that true of your work in particular?
Well, I hope so. I don't know. I wouldn't like to. I never like to sort of impose or suggest what anyone should feel from looking at my work, because I appreciate everyone's going to get something quite different from it. And even as speaking to people last night, some people were sort of interpreting it in ways that I hadn't thought of, but I was like, oh yeah, actually that makes a lot of sense. But no, I mean, I wouldn't like to speculate about how my work would influence people, but I think, that's sort of my...
I mean, in some ways, one of the reasons we stick on exhibitions and show our artwork is not just to show people and tell people our thoughts about things, but actually to get feedback on that. And so kind of create these spaces where we can have a discussion about the work and kind of learn things from other people's perspectives. It's not us being dogmatic about just telling people this is what we think. I mean, half the time we're still working all these ideas out. So having those conversations is really important.
And I think, like, especially post-COVID, like being in a shared space with other artists has been a really massive thing, and it's a real kind of privilege and joy to kind of to be sharing the space with such a lovely group of artists as well. And so I suppose as well, but like that really answers the question.
What Camilla, do you want to, in terms of people coming away from the show having looked at your work in particular, is there anything you'd like them to particularly come away with?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just summarise what I kind of said throughout the panel, which is really to be more aware of health forests, to be able to follow constant actions, and also to allow themselves to be more creative, and to see, you know, or like not allow themselves to be more creative, but to maybe just see different art making techniques which are not mainstream, which are more accessible. It's probably a better way to put it.
Danielle, in terms of your work, what's the thing you want people to kind of come away with having looked at your drawings? All three pieces. So.
I would quite like them to, I think its placement in the wider context of the exhibition maybe is, I would want people to come away with a sense of just memory and that sense of it all together, and hopefully that gives someone a bit of resilience, because they might find someone who's they might, if they connect with it, they might get a sense that other people have been in the same way they are, and they're also connected to the world around them in a similar way that they are. So that perhaps, I'm not sure, perhaps that.
Yeah, no, it does. And Nicola, with your work, sort of, is there a sense of something you want people to take away with them, having seen and touched the work?
Whatever that they felt and thought is good.
Yeah. A very personal, whatever, yeah.
I mean, I'd like at least one person to have felt something emotionally interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which maybe resonates with their own memories and stories and things. Christina, what about you in terms of people having seen your work here at the gallery? What's that thing you want people to kind of come away with? If you can summarise it.
I think one of the first things is just the more simplicity of these and being more being in the world. It's the more people I meet, the more community, whatever the context and environment, it feels like the breadth there just grows each time. And I think in this idea of this climate of hope is just, it is amazing how many things people are doing all over the world to kind of make this kind of community change, how they transform the things, how they and even with what seems maybe like the least amount of kind of economic or social or cultural or political or privilege of power, it's really extraordinary. And I think that's one of the things that I think in terms of the work, this idea of that this marine side of it was actually been hidden for quite a long time because many communities are very protective of their power and their knowledge systems for a good reason, but it's also amazing how much that's coming through and how much change is being made. And I think there's always that space for radical hope and then through that transformation. So I think that's the main thing that you can imagine it, you can dream it, whether it's making an account of a specific space or world, or whether that's someone else leaving their exhibition after seeing everyone's work and having this kind of circulation of how people plays with people or whatever it may be. And I think there's always that space of transformation. I think that's the key thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, Britt, you're not here as an artist, but I know we spoke briefly, just as a sort of final note for you. You talked to me a little bit earlier about hope and why that's important as a scientist. Maybe just to finish, could you sort of summarise a little bit your thoughts on that?
As someone who's not an artist here, what I've taken away from this exhibition is that it's so nice to see so many artists out there that are engaging in this kind of work because it's so important. So I would just say, keep doing what you're doing, because I think, art, it plays such an important role in also cultural change, so people need to see these ideas more in popular culture and also, through the arts and exhibitions and things like that. So it's really important to get that visibility of these kinds of topics. And then in terms of hope, it's also something that we talk a lot about in the scientific community, that it's so important to not just be all about doom and gloom, which it can be hard to not get bogged down by that. But it's really important to spread these messages of hope and to share success stories related to climate, but also any type of conservation and things like that, because there are really great things happening out there, and there's great projects that are having success in terms of biodiversity coming back and things like that, and that all helps with the climate. So it's really important to share those kinds of stories, because if people, it's the way that news and media works as well, is that they like the more doom and gloom stories, because that's what people are latched onto more, and that's what sells in terms of getting more viewers and things. But actually, these stories of hope, that's what inspires people to actually implement change, because otherwise they just think that it's all just doom and gloom, and you just give up and you think, well, why should I bother? And there's a whole movement in ocean science and ocean conservation, it's called ocean optimism and conservation optimism for terrestrial ecosystems as well. And I think it started from some students that were studying ocean conservation, and just they felt like they were writing obituaries to
planet, basically.
So actually they sort of started to change the narrative about the types of science that they were doing, also the messaging that they were giving to the public. So I think that's also, the exact same applies to art. So I think in, artistic practices, it's so important to also share these messages of hope. Yeah.
That's a really positive and nice message for us to end on. Really relevant for the theme of the show. So thank you everybody for attending the discussion panel today, and for everybody for showing your work at the exhibition. Thank you also for everybody watching here in person, and to everybody watching on the recording as well for later. But yes, it's been a real pleasure to speak with you. So and on that, we'll leave it at that.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.